Hello, everyone. Here we are. Looking forward to spending some time with you tonight while we answer these marriage questions. Two of them, one for each of us. And so I'm going to share the first question that was sent to us. Someone wrote me and said, "How should I respond when my husband mocks my Christian beliefs? My husband claims to be a Christian, but he randomly says the church is really his wife's church, and it's ridiculous to believe in creation over evolution. Occasionally, he does this in front of the kids, too." So, someone asked about her husband who claims to be a Christian, but mocks her beliefs and makes other statements that sound very contradictory to Christianity. So, first, I would say from what it sounds like you're saying, it's hard to believe that your husband is a believer. Perhaps he is, but it's really hard to reconcile the description you gave, the actions of your husband, with the behavior of a Christian man. Even an immature, largely baby Christian wouldn't really act like this. So while it's possible someone could be a Christian and believe in evolution, it's hard to imagine a man who would be ridiculing your Christian beliefs if he himself is a believer. So this would demonstrate really a hostility toward the gospel that to me would indicate that he's an unbeliever. And so the first thing I'd say to you is you should probably pray for your husband's salvation. It might be tempting to want to pray that he would embrace creationism or that he would stop ridiculing your beliefs, but I would say that these issues largely pale in comparison to the major issue that your husband seems to be unregenerate. Also, these issues are probably more symptoms of the real problem, the problem that he's not saved. And so the best solution would be that he becomes a Christian and then these symptoms either improve or largely just resolve themselves when he's born again. Second, you also mentioned that he does this in front of the children. And my suspicion is when he says these things that are critical of Christianity in front of your kids, you probably want to argue with him. And I want to briefly discourage you from doing that, and here's why. Let me just share one verse. In 1 Corinthians 7:15, Paul said, "If the unbeliever departs, let him depart." This isn't depart for you. I'm not talking about your husband departing or anything. But Paul says, "If the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases." And then he says, "But God has called us to peace." God has called us to peace. And this is the important part. Verses like Romans 12:18, where it says, "If it's possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." Verses like that call us to peace. But specifically here in 1 Corinthians 7:15, Paul is speaking about marriage. And he's calling husbands and wives to recognize that they're called to peace with each other. And the reason is we have a testimony that if we're Christians, our lives are going to be characterized by peace. And so when there's conflict, when there's arguing within the marriage relationship, it's a bad witness of Christ. And I know we all obviously have arguments, there's conflict in every marriage, but when it takes place, it reflects poorly on Christ. So that's one of the main reasons that Paul says this. And probably the other reason he says this is people are not won over through conflict or arguing. It's rare that someone can be argued into believing something. I heard a quote one time, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." And so the idea is if you were to argue your husband into submission or essentially, try to convict him through some sort of hostile conversation, the chances are his pride and flesh will flare up and he'll just continue to argue with you. Or else, if he finally does just sort of concede, it'll be more out of just weariness associated with fighting and so forth. So I would discourage you from trying to argue with him, even if you're largely tempted to do that. And I understand your concern about what your children are seeing and hearing from your husband, especially when he's saying these sorts of things. And I don't want to minimize it. It's definitely concerning when you want your children to love the Lord and then their father is saying things like this. But when your kids see you responding in a loving way to your husband, in fact, I would say the more unloving or harsh or critical he is toward you or toward Christianity, that's great. You have an even greater opportunity to be a witness for Christ in that situation, because the more loving, kind, gentle, respectful you are toward him, with the worst he's being, then the greater that contrast or that example is, the better your children will be able to see Christ through you and recognize the gospel working through you and see Jesus, really. So that would be the best way for your children to come to know Christ. And so every time your husband is being harsh or cruel, it's really an opportunity for your children to see Christ and see the gospel through you. But really, that's only if you can be a reflection of Christ in those moments, as difficult as it is. If your children see you flare up, look like your husband by arguing, being hostile toward him, then your children won't see any difference between you and your husband. They'll be as convinced of your lack of salvation or poor reflection of Christ as they are of their dad's. Because that would really be the alternative to you being kind and gentle toward your husband would be arguing with him and being hostile toward him, which would just be that bad witness that I suspect would probably convince your children of the weakness of the gospel in a person's life. So the way it is now, you seem to be the one parent who has the potential to influence your children for Christ. And so this is difficult for me to say. I really hate to say this. But you do obviously have a much larger load than a mother who would have a Christian husband. But to be honest with you, that's just the reality of your situation, that your children probably have one Christian parent in their lives, and they really need you to work extra hard to serve the Lord and be that influence for Christ in their lives. They're going to look back on the way that you responded to your husband and remember that it was Jesus working through you that allowed you to respond lovingly and respectfully toward him, despite the hostility that you were facing.
Yeah, and I hadn't planned on talking about this, but Scott made me think that your children are learning from you also how to respond to someone who believes in evolution or these different things they're going to face that their dad is talking about. They're learning from you how to respond. And right above our fireplace, you can't see it, but Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." Oh, there it is. One of my chalkboard things.
Chalkboard, yeah. So that's what we happen to have written there right now.
Yeah, so we have that written there. A gentle answer turns away wrath. So that's just a really neat proverb and something to keep in mind and cling to. I don't know, it's every time I put it into practice, it seems to work. It's hard to get angry at someone who's gentle. So responding gently to him will definitely work better than being wrathful in return. And something else I thought of in chapter 2 in Scott's book, he says, whenever you start to become frustrated toward your spouse, turn any frustrations into prayer. Take any feelings of hurt, betrayal, or disappointment and pray that God will help your spouse grow in the area that is upsetting you. So I think that really applies to this question. And Scott and I were talking today about how this can actually apply to any relationship in your life. It doesn't even necessarily have to be with your spouse, but any frustrations you have toward people, allow the Lord to use that in your life, to turn it into prayer for that person and in turn for you, because it's pretty much impossible that we're never at fault at all, so we can pray for ourselves. Okay, so my question that I'm answering is, in a situation where the husband and wife don't agree on theological things, and in this case probably non-essential things, with the wife doing most of the teaching of the children, which should she teach them, and how should either husband or wife respond to the kids noticing or questioning these inconsistencies? Like if she's talking to her kids about something theological and they say, but Daddy said, or Daddy is talking to them and they say, that's not what Mommy said. So that's a great question. And we didn't really, you can chime in anytime you want. We didn't really get to talk about my answer, but we can relate to this because we don't agree on everything theologically. One kind of random thing, I'm not positive we go directly to heaven when we die. I wonder if we go to what's called Abraham's bosom. Scott's convinced, right? That we go straight to heaven. When Paul said, I'd rather be absent from the body and present with the Lord, Scott sees that as saying, when you're absent from the body, you're present with the Lord. I see that as, hey, I'd rather be, but it's not saying that's what happens. So that's just an example of a little non-essential difference that we have.
Yeah, I think I'd just clarify that. If anyone's listening and they hear us say that we have theological differences, I don't know if they'll wonder the magnitude of them. It's not a real consequence. The differences are relatively minor and don't affect our relationship or minister or anything like that. But yeah, that's one of them. I think that's probably kind of a notorious one in our relationship, that where I think that there was kind of hold to the two compartment theory of Abraham's bosom, where the rich man and Lazarus went, the place of torment and the place of comfort, and Jesus emptied that, the place of comfort. You read about it in Ephesians 4, and Katie doesn't like to hear me.
And I don't think that's what Ephesians 4 is talking about. So as you can see, we don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
And there's a couple other things I could share, but you'll probably think I'm the weirdo because I don't go with the mainstream. So, but the kids, if we say like we're reading in this passage and we come across that, Scott and I just say, yeah, mommy thinks this and daddy thinks that. And I think it's good for our kids to see that. So I wanted to look at my notes here real quick. People disagree, and that's okay. And I don't think this is an issue of submission for the wife. I don't think she's not being submissive by teaching the kids, hey, this is what mommy thinks, this is what daddy thinks, unless the husband said, I want you to teach the kids this, and she refused, then I would see that as an issue of submission. But if the husband's like, yeah, I don't agree with you, you don't agree with me, we can talk to the kids about that openly. However, the important thing is that you respectfully disagree with each other. So we have fun with each other. We don't get fired up, usually, about these things. We do see them as non-essentials. And so we just talk about them, and the kids can witness that. And that's a good thing for them to see, because they're not always going to agree with everyone in their life. They're not always going to agree with their brothers and sisters in Christ. And so they're watching mommy and daddy to see how we respond to each other when we disagree, and we just need to make sure that we honor one another and are respectful toward each other. And as far as what to teach them, I would say you can share, mommy thinks this and daddy thinks this about this passage, and what do you guys think? And don't try to like sway them either way. Allowing your children to think for themselves is important. I know that a lot of children aren't taught to think for themselves, and then they get out from under mommy and daddy, and they don't really know why they believe what they believe, and they're just blown over by every argument or wind of doctrine because they never were taught how to think for themselves. So you can even ask them, what do you think this passage is saying? Ask them if they have any questions. It doesn't have to be awkward, and it's okay, like I said, for mommy and daddy to disagree. Just reiterate to them it's how you disagree. Don't talk down about your spouse or make them sound stupid for their belief, and don't talk about them in a condescending way. Remind them that many Bible scholars disagree on different things. Scott often points that out. And this might be different with essentials like Jesus is God in the flesh, or being saved by grace through faith as opposed to being saved by works. Those are different things altogether.
Categories. Those are essentials, deal breakers.
But this person that wrote in said you non-essentials. So that's how I would deal with it. It doesn't have to be awkward or bad, right?
Right. I think sometimes we think that the best or healthiest, strongest marriages would be with those individuals who have the most in common or are the most in agreement, whether theological or other issues. But the reality is the healthiest and most joyful marriages are not those with the greatest compatibility. They're the relationships where there is a large amount of deference and patience toward each other, because you're not going to find two people who never encounter an amount of incompatibility. And sometimes people get together, and the little hearts are over your head, boop, 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 and you just look at this person and think, we're never going to disagree about anything. But disagreements arise, and so the issue is, what do you do when those disagreements arise, and how do you handle them?
Do you want to look at Carrie's?
Okay.
Carrie said Vanessa said that her and Carrie had many theological differences and used to have debates during Bible study time, but she stopped arguing with him and let him teach. So I think that's a good point. I probably should clarify that you don't want to just have a debate. Oh, here we go, we're going to open the Bible. That means mommy and daddy are going to start their debate. That's not a good thing either. So I guess my point is, you just don't want it to be like, you're not allowed to disagree. You want to respect one another. And if it turns into a debate every time.
Well, the rest of her comment, she said, we keep our family worship time for daddy's perspective, but if they catch us at the table having these discussions, mommy speaks her mind. And I think that's great, Vanessa. I do, because your husband, because Carrie's called to be the head of your relationship, the pastor or shepherd of the family. And so I appreciate your respect for that position, that role that he has, and God will work through you honoring that. And during the family worship times, it's very much that he's the pastor of his family, and so while it would be acceptable to ask him a question or if you want to disagree with them, it would be better if that took place privately. I've known a few men who have essentially refused to open the Bible with their families because they feel like every time they do, it's going to be a debate with their wives, where their wives challenge everything that comes out of their mouths. And I would say, ladies, if your husband opens the Word with you, that's the time to encourage him. And it's not to say that that everything he says is going to be right or correct. But when you disagree with him or you want to correct him, I'd encourage you to try to do it privately. And then later, if you've won him over or convinced him that what you were saying was right, then in the next family Bible study, he can point that out and say, hey, Daddy said something yesterday that wasn't right. And if he's a humble man, hopefully he'll point out that you're the one that shared that with him. Although hopefully, that'd kind of be pride if it was that important for that to be pointed out. But anyway, so yeah, just try to make sure that your children see you respecting your husband.
And I also think it depends on the age of your kids, don't you think? Like, I would think if we had a 15 or 16-year-old or 17 or 18, we would probably talk with them more about these things. But I think especially early on, it is important for the kids to be seeing mommy respect daddy and not having a bunch of arguments, right?
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes we think about these theological differences that might exist in marriage. And again, to be clear, especially if someone just tuned in, we're not talking about essentials or deal breakers. We're not talking about disagreeing about the gospel. We understand the Bible commands to be equally yoked, and we're not dismissing that or trying to overlook it. But regarding some of those smaller issues that we could put in the category of non-essentials, we need to recognize that more important than those theological differences is peace within the relationship and harmony within the home. And so, do you really want to fight with your husband, or husband, do you really want to fight with your wife over this issue that kind of pales in comparison to the love and compassion and gentleness that your children should see in their parents' relationship? And so, yeah, maybe you've got this little point, could even be a minute one, and you're just absolutely convinced it's so important that your children know the truth on it. Is it really worth convincing them that truth at the expense of this huge, terrible argument with your husband and possibly making him look incompetent or inept in front of your children? I would submit that it's not. It'd be better for your children to see the quality relationship of a husband who loves and cherishes his wife, and a wife who respects her husband. So.
And I wanted to share one more thing from chapter 13 in Scott's book. It's titled What Submission Does Not Mean. And something I've been thinking about more, especially as my kids get older and I develop a healthy fear of rebellion. I just see this like danger in rebellion that I haven't really noticed before or been afraid of before in a healthy way. But in this chapter, Scott said, just as Jesus is the example of submission, so Satan offers the premier example of rebelliousness. Scripture gives us vivid images of Satan's original rejection of God as his head, which resulted in his being cast down and out of heaven. And then in the Garden of Eden, we see him as a serpent stirring up similar rebellion in Eve. You will not surely die, for God knows in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So Satan is saying here, in essence, you don't need to submit to God. You can have his position instead. You can be just like him. And I was thinking about how that can be tempting as wives to be like that, to be like, you don't have to listen to him. That voice we hear, our flesh.
Right,
yeah, and when we're doing that, we're actually being more like Satan, which sounds terrible, but it's true. And then it says, he said, when we think of submission, we should think about how Jesus was willing to submit what he was willing to submit to, and most importantly, why he was willing to submit. So that was just encouraging and sobering for me to think of when I don't submit, it's really an act of rebellion and sin. And same when a husband doesn't submit or doesn't love his wife, I guess it's a form of rebellion against God as well.
Yeah.
That's it for me.
Okay.
Will you have your last thing you wanted to
All
share?
right. So one last thing to share. I was invited to be the speaker for the Christian Heritage Marriage Retreat, and I just want to briefly mention Christian Heritage if you're unfamiliar with it. It is a family discipleship ministry. They have a large conference each year, and we've been really blessed. Each time we've attended, we've been blessed by the ministry. We believe in it. We believe in the people that work behind the scenes and organize it, and we have some familiarity with people on the board, and I get a lot of invites to give money certain ways or time. There's definitely not enough money or time to serve all of the needs or causes that come my way. But Christian Heritage is one that I really strongly believe in, and I don't get paid or anything for any of this. I'm sharing this because I believe in their ministry. I believe in family discipleship and family worship, and
Can
that's
I
what
share
they
something?
present. Or
sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, he hates conferences, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I love conferences. I wish we could go to like a conference every month.
Mm-hmm.
So I got him to go to this conference. This probably would have been 5 years ago. And I said, can we just try this out? We went with some of our closest friends. And we went, and I remember when we walked in, he was just like, this is different. There's something different here. I love it here. We both just loved it. Loved the
Culture, the
culture
environment,
of it, and
seeing the families.
yeah,
all
the
together,
teaching and the emphasis
conservative
on
values.
husbands leading, and it's just really neat. If you can go, I highly recommend it. But we're talking about the marriage conference right now, so go ahead.
Yeah. So first, we'd encourage you to check out Christian Heritage, and second, they have a marriage retreat. They just started last year. Last year was the first year, and this is their second year having it, and they've invited me to be their speaker. And I'll have all this information probably in the comment section and on YouTube in the comment section too. But it's February 15th and 16th. In
16.
February 16th, what did I say?
You said 15.
Oh, thank you. See, so we're just talking about wives correcting their husbands. And that was a beneficial correction there. So February 16th and 17th. February 16th and 17th, which is a Thursday and Friday in Leavenworth, Washington at the Enzian Inn. It's $179. They only have 33 spots. I suppose that's how many the facility can hold. The registration closes on January 16th, so we would love to have you there with us. We're hoping that we could have some good friends there. Because it's Thursday and Friday, we're even thinking it might be kind of cool to stay an extra night, Friday night, and then have Friday evening together and possibly Saturday.
Yeah, because it looks like the conference closes down at 4:30 on Friday. So I told Scott, man, it'd be cool since some people are driving pretty far too if we stayed an extra night, so that would be fun.
So if you make it there, we actually thought it was going to be closer to Woodland. We thought it was going to be like an hour and a half away. And then we thought probably a lot of people from our church and some at Westminster, another church that's close to us, has a lot of families, and Christian Heritage would be attending. But now it's about 4.5 hours from Woodland, but that puts it a lot closer to the Tri-Cities area. And so we'll probably connect with a lot of people that we don't normally connect with that aren't in our typical circles of relationships. And so anyway, we hope you can make it. We'd love to see you there. We hope there's a really good turnout, and then maybe there'll be a larger one next year. I'm not exactly sure. But
And for the ladies, Leavenworth looks beautiful. I'm sure the guys don't care too much, but this Enzian Inn is awesome.
yeah, it does look great. Yep, I've never been there. It does look great. I'm sure a lot of people watching this probably have some familiarity with it. Katie and I don't really leave Woodland very much.
No.
We were here kind of in two places, the parsonage here or the church right next door. That's where our lives pretty much take place. So you also get, it's advertised on the site, a free copy of my book. And I think I'll have the workbook. I expect to have the workbook finished by then. And so...
No, you can't. Sorry, Jeremy.
You threw me off, Jeremy. So I'll have that information, but I do hope that you guys can make it. I think it'll be a wonderful time. We're really looking forward to it. And there's actually another marriage retreat in Seaside. Is that in January?
No, I don't know if that's
I don't
open
know
to-
if it's
sorry.
open to everyone. Never mind. I'll try to find out about that. Another marriage retreat I've been invited to be the speaker for, and probably in our next video I'll find out if it's open to other people or just the church that invited me. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. It's pretty much working out perfectly. We're not getting overwhelmed by questions, but we're glad to get your questions, and we're just basically tackling 2 per Thursday night, 8:30. Tune in, and if you miss it, we will put it on YouTube, and then I'll have it on my blog. And so thanks a lot for tuning in. We appreciate your love for Christ and for marriages, and that is our desire. It's twofold, to see marriages strengthened and to see Christ exalted. We covet your prayers for that to take place in our ministry, through our lives. And so the church should do our own retreat. We are talking about that, Vanessa. And so here's the thing. The pastor of your church, me, I preached on marriage for like a year. So I'm wondering if people are kind of like marriaged out. I'm wondering if people are like heard too much on marriage, and they want a break, and so we'd have to have a retreat on something
Plus the workbook,
else.
he's coming out with a workbook which has a whole bunch of new stuff. So we're thinking about that, Vanessa. And hi, Roseanne. And yeah, beach camp. That's family camp.
So, all right. Well, God bless you guys. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next Thursday night at 8:30 p.m. God bless you.
Bye.